Mr. Men Adventure in Magicland by Roger Hargreaves. Little Miss Magic had decided to take all her friends on a day out, but she had not told them where they were going. It was to be a surprise. The first surprise was when Little Miss Magic turned up at the bus stop on a magic flying carpet. Everyone climbed aboard the carpet. They flew high in the air over No-Nonsense Land and Happy Land and Cold Land, all the way to Magicland, Little Miss Magic's favourite place in the world. There is a piggy flying. Surprise! Cried Little Miss Magic. But you will not be surprised to hear that everything in Magicland was magic. The trees could walk, the pigs could fly, the flowers could talk, even the air sparkled with magic. Everybody, called Little Miss Magic, I would like you to meet a friend of mine. They all looked round, but they could not see anyone. Who was Little Miss Magic talking about? Suddenly, there was a flash and a puff of pink smoke. My friend Wizard Wilf, she finished, introducing.
Having pizza.
Daddy is having pizza.
Neo's Daddy having pizza.
That's right, Neo's Daddy having pizza. My friend Wizard Wilf, she finished, introducing the rather round and jolly-looking wizard who had just magically appeared out of thin air. Wizard Wilf is going to be our guide to Magicland, explained Little Miss Magic. You don't look like much of a wizard to me, scoffed Mr. Uppity rudely. I promise you I am, said Wizard Wilf. Go on, prove it, said Mr. Uppity.
Jumping up the forest.
He is jumping up in the flowers. Wizard Wilf whipped his magic wand out of his sleeve and muttered some magic words. With a flash and a bang, Mr. Whippity turned into a toad. Mr. Uppity turned into a toad? Well, you did ask, laughed Wizard Wilf. Mr. Man. Now we have a very long way to go, so I suggest that you each put on a pair of those magic boots. Mr. Man, said Wilf. Each step you take in this boots will be bigger than any step you have ever taken and will mean that you can all keep up.
Daddy's Mr. Man.
Yeah, Daddy's Mr. Man. Mr. Slow, who usually walks at the snail's pace, could not believe it. Right over a river in one step. Yeah, he's jumping over the river. Mr. Tall did not need a pair of the boots. He already had a very long stride. They all set off, following Wizard Wilf's lead. As they bounded along in their magic boots, they came to a field, and in the field was a unicorn. But that was not all. There was also a griffin. Yeah, riding the, well, it looks like a cockatoo. It's actually like a griffin, so that means it's got the head of an eagle and the body of a lion. That's what a griffin is. And a cow, a peak Magicland cow. Mr. Rush wanted to know which was the fastest, so they had a race around the field. And of course, Mr. Rush won. They're rushing around the field, aren't they? After their race, they came to a wooden bridge spanning a river too wide even for magic boots. We will have to find another way to cross the river, said Wilf. An evil troll lives under this bridge, and he will eat anyone who sets foot on it. Wilf pulled out his wand and waved it in the air. Abracadabra, he cried. A rainbow appeared out of nowhere, and everyone walked safely over the rainbow to the other side. The troll was very disappointed. And then they came to a small, round, jolly-looking cottage. This is my house, said Wilf. We can stop here and have lunch. Mr. Lazy was exhausted, and with a sigh, he collapsed into the sofa.
No chairs.
Yeah, but he landed on the floor. Bang! Ouch! Cried Mr. Lazy. He could not believe it. The sofa had moved, all on its own. Mr. Lazy tried again to sit down. But this was a Magicland sofa, and it had no intention of being sat upon. When they had their lunch, it was also rather messy because all the dishes had run away with the spoons. Oh, look, all the food's on the table. After lunch, they reached the Blue Mountains, where the Wicked Witch lived in a dark and gloomy cave. "I smell something cooking," smiled Mr. Greedy, rubbing his tummy. There was a large cauldron bubbling on the fire, but it was a witch's cauldron. A witch's cauldron full of a magic potion of bats' wings and lizards' tails and beetles and thistles. "Yuck!" cried Mr. Greedy as he leaned in over the cauldron. But Mr. Greedy's eyes lit up when he next saw a large, shiny red apple in a bowl. He was about to take a big bite when little Miss Magic cried, "Stop! That's the Wicked Witch's poisoned apple!" "Is there nothing I can eat here?" grumbled Mr. Greedy. Mr. Greedy's empty tummy replied with a growl. And then little Miss Magic found a cupboard full of the witch's magic brooms. Everyone went out and played tag, flying tag. Suddenly, the Wicked Witch arrived with a dreadful rumble of thunder in a great black cloud. She was in an awful mood. She scowled and growled and gnashed her teeth. She shook her fists and screamed in a rage. It was a terrifying sight to behold. Mr. Brave quivered and shook in fear, but as it turned out, her new boots were too tight. After a foot bath and a cup of tea, she was as right as rain, not at all wicked, although she did have a rather disagreeable cackle. It was nearly time to return home, but there was one last thing that Wilf wanted to show them. He led them into a wood where they found a wishing well. "If you each throw in a coin," explained Wilf, "then your wish will come true." Everyone did as he said and made a wish. Everyone except Mr. Mean. You would not catch Mr. Mean throwing his money down a well. Little Miss Magic then summoned her magic carpet, and they all said goodbye to Wilf. When they got back home, the most extraordinary things began to happen.
Apple.
Yeah, a big apple. Mr. Slow was fast. Mr. Sneeze stopped sneezing. Little Miss Shy was filled with confidence. And Mr. Greedy had the largest apple you have ever seen. All their wishing well wishes had come true. Everyone was happy. Everyone except Mr. Mean. "Bother," he said with a deep frown. "I should have thrown in one coin and wished for two." The end.
Welcome to Books for Kids by Flying Dragons. Mr. Men Go Cycling by Roger Hargreaves. Every year, all the Mr. Men and Little Miss take part in a bicycle race called the Grand Tour. It is a very long race through many different countries. Everyone practices very hard on their bikes before the race. Mr. Tall had a unicycle with only one wheel. To ride it, you need to have very good balance and long legs. Mr. Jelly has a bike with two wheels. You also need good balance to ride it, although Mr. Jelly is a rather wobbly rider. But not because he has just learnt to ride his bike. Mr. Jelly is always wobbly. Mr. Small has a tricycle with 3 wheels, which is easier to ride when you are little. Mr. Bump has a far more unusual bike. It is an octocycle, which has 8 wheels and needs no balance at all. Mr. Bump had started with a tricycle and then kept adding wheels until he stopped falling over. Mr. Busy was very busy cycling everywhere. He never missed a chance to practice. He even cycled to the bathroom to clean his teeth in the morning. And Mr. Silly practiced wearing flippers. How silly! I cannot imagine how he thought he was ever going to win a cycling race wearing flippers. The person that everyone could imagine winning the race was Mr. Rush. This was probably because he had won the Grand Tour every year. He was so fast that you could barely see him. He was just a purple blur. This year the race started in Happyland. Little Miss Stubborn did not get off to a good start. She stubbornly refused to go around the potholes and got a flat tire. Luckily, Mr. Strong was on hand to blow her tire back up. Or maybe it was not so lucky. Just one of Mr. Strong's breaths was far too much. After riding through Happyland, the cyclist got to Coldland, where the heavy snow made it very hard going, and poor Mr. Nosy caught a cold. It was warmer in Sleepyland, but now all the riders kept falling asleep, which gave Mr. Lazy an advantage. He could ride a bicycle and sleep at the same time. The weather in Badland was bad, really bad. In fact, it was atrocious, but Mr. Brave braved it bravely. And then they came to the most difficult stage of the tour, Upland, where the roads only go uphill. But everything that goes up must come down, and the next day they rode into Downland, where the roads only go downhill. Easy peasy. Now, each year...
That flew off.
Yeah, someone's falling off.
Yeah.
Now, each year the race ends in a different country, but nobody knows which one it will be. It was a surprise. And this year the surprise was Nonsense Land. But that was not the only surprise. When they reached Nonsense Land, all the riders had to wear flippers. What nonsense! How silly! However, there was one rider who thought this was perfectly sensible. And I think that you know who that was. That's right, Mr. Silly. He tore past all the other riders. He even overtook Mr. Rush. And he won the race. A win that no one could have ever imagined. But then, as they say, practice makes perfect. The end. If you like this video, please subscribe down below.
Mr. Men by Roger Hargreaves, an ABC book. A is for apple, and there's Mr. Bump catching the apple. He's throwing it up and down and trying to catch it.
Oh, apple.
That's right, apple.
She's an apple.
That's right. B is for bus, a red bus that Mr. Rush...
Mr. Kite.
He does look like a kite. Mr. Rush does look like a kite, but that's Mr. Rush driving the bus. There's C, and it's a green car with square wheels. Why do you think a car would have square wheels?
Funny car.
Very funny car. D is for dog, and that dog is wearing a hat. What a funny dog. E is for elephant, and there's an elephant.
Following the egg.
Yeah.
Following the egg.
Yeah, elephants often are holding on to eggs when we look at these books, don't we? Because egg also starts with E. F is for flower. And there's Mr. Small looking up at the flower because the flower's bigger than Mr. Small is. G is for giraffe.
Funny giraffe.
Funny giraffe. H is for hat. What a beautiful pink hat. I is for ice cream. And there's Mr. Greedy eating a big ice cream. J is for jelly. Mr. Jelly goes wibble wobble wibble wobble wibble wobble wibble wobble. K is for king. He looks very kingly. L is for lion. Rawr.
And the monkey.
And a monkey. M is for monkey. N is for nest. The birdie lays her eggs in the nest. O is for orange. What a big orange that is. It's bigger than that Mr. Man. P is for pencil.
What's that one up?
Oh, P is for pencil. And Mr. Small looks so small next to that pencil. Q is for queen. The queen.
Mrs. Shaw in the shower.
Yeah, the queen is married to the king. R is for rainbow. And S,
What's that one?
that is a snowball. It's a ball made of snow. A snowball. And it is bigger than the Mr. Man that is holding it. T is for teddy. U is for umbrella. The umbrella is stopping Mr. Uppity from getting wet in the rain. V is for van. W is for whale. And the whale's blowing a big blowhole. Big water out of his blowhole. X is for xylophone.
What's that one sleeping in the boat?
Y is for yacht. Mr. Rush, purple Mr. Rush, is in the boat. And it's got a number 7 on the sail. And Y is for yacht.
Yes.
Z is for zebra. How many zebras are there? 2 zebras. All right, do you want to come see all of the alphabet now? A is for apple. B is for bus. C is for car. D is for dog. E is for elephant. F is for flower. G is for giraffe. H is for hat. I is for ice cream. J is for jelly. K is for king. L is for lion. M is for monkey. N is for nest. O is for orange. P is for pencil. Q is for queen. R is for rainbow. S is for snowball. T is for teddy. U is for umbrella. V is for van. W is for whale. X is for xylophone. Y is for yacht. And Z is for zebra. Yay! If you like this video, please hit subscribe. We've got plenty more Mr. Men videos. Welcome to Books for Kids by Flying Dragons. This morning we're reading Mr. Rood by Roger Hargreaves, a Mr. Men book.
Mr. Mango.
Mr. Men book. When you meet somebody, you might think to yourself that that person has a large nose, but you wouldn't say that to them, would you? Because that would be rude, wouldn't it? Well, Mr. Rood would just blurt it out, big nose, but he wouldn't stop there. Oh no, not Mr. Rood. Big nose? With a nose like that, you could vacuum the floor. Can you imagine saying that to somebody? Well, I hope you can't. And he was the same with everybody. If he met somebody who was overweight, he would shout, "Fatty, you're supposed to take the food out of the fridge, not eat the fridge as well." When he was driving along in his car, he would yell rude things at the people he passed by. Mr. Rood was a horrible man who didn't have a nice thing to say to anybody. Not surprisingly, nobody liked him. One day, Mr. Rood met little Miss Tiny, or not so much met as nearly trod on her.
Tiny.
She's tiny. "Good morning," said little Miss Tiny. "Look at the size of you," exclaimed Mr. Rood. "Squirt, you're so tiny I could squash you under my thumb."
Find tiny.
I know, Mr. Man found the tiny. "You're so tiny I could squash you under my thumb." Poor little Miss Tiny burst into tears and ran home. Behind a tree on the other side of the lane, Mr. Happy looked anything but happy. He had heard everything. The next morning, Mr. Happy was outside Mr. Rood's house, suitcase in hand. Mr. Happy knocked on Mr. Rood's front door. "Go away!" shouted Mr. Rood. Mr. Happy knocked again. Mr. Rood opened the door. "Can't you read?" said Mr. Rood, pointing to his doormat. Mr. Rood's doormat did not say welcome like everybody else's doormat. Mr. Rood had crossed out welcome and then in large block letters had written "Go away" underneath. Mr. Happy smiled, barged past Mr. Rood and went into the living room. "Get out!" shouted Mr. Rood. Mr. Happy smiled an even larger smile and sat down in the armchair. Mr. Rood exploded. He ranted and raged for half an hour, but Mr. Calmly happily sat through it all, smiling. Calmly sat through it all. Eventually, Mr. Rood went into the kitchen to make himself supper without offering any to Mr. Happy. After his supper, Mr. Rood ranted and raged for a full hour, but whatever Mr. Rood called him, Mr. Happy took no notice. Finally, Mr. Rood turned out the lights and went upstairs without offering Mr. Happy a bed for the night. When Mr. Rood came down in the morning, Mr. Happy was still there, still smiling. "Okay, I give in," said Mr. Rood. "What do you want?" "Breakfast would be nice," said Mr. Happy. "Please." Mr. Rood made breakfast for him. It was the first time in Mr. Rood's life that he had ever done anything for somebody else. In fact, it was the first time he had ever asked anybody what they wanted. "Thank you," said Mr. Happy when he had finished. "Right, you can go now," demanded Mr. Rood. But Mr. Happy did not budge. Mr. Rood ranted and raged and raged and ranted, but he ended up making lunch for Mr. Happy and supper. He even offered Mr. Happy a bed that night. Mr. Happy stayed for a fortnight. Slowly the ranting and raging became less and less. Mr. Rood discovered he had something that he had never known he possessed: manners. When it was time for Mr. Happy to leave, he shook Mr. Rood's hand and said, "Thank you so much, Mr. Rood. I really enjoyed my stay." Mr. Rood beamed a smile that was every bit as wide as Mr. Happy's and found himself saying, "And so did I." Mr. Rood was a changed man. "Burp," belched Mr. Rood. Well, almost. If you liked this book, please click subscribe below. Thank you. Mr. Men in Scotland by Roger Hargreaves. Read by Books for Kids by Flying Dragons. Mr. Strong had always wanted to go to the Highland Games in Scotland. He was going to compete in the caber tossing event, a sport that was ideally suited to Mr. Strong, as it was all about strength. Tossing a tree kind of strength. He invited his friends to come too. They left a few days before the competition and planned to see the sights along the way. Mr. Strong had trouble packing his caber. They all caught the train to Scotland. On their way in Edinburgh, they passed the Forth Bridge. Little Miss Curious wondered what had happened to the first, the second, and the third bridges. Mr. Clever explained that it was named after the River Forth. Little Miss Curious thought for a moment. "So what happened to the River First, the River Second, and the River Third?" she asked. Mr. Clever sighed. It was going to be a very long day. The next morning, Mr. Uppity went to wake Mr. Lazy. "Get up," he yelled. "We are going for a walk up the Royal Mile to see Edinburgh Castle." "A mile? I can't walk a mile," cried Mr. Lazy, and he turned over and went straight back to sleep. Mr. Uppity marched the others up the streets of the Royal Mile, where they had a great view of the castle on its rock. Mr. Lazy also enjoyed a view of the castle. A view from his bed, through one eye, one half-closed sleepy eye. In the afternoon, Little Miss Splendid wanted to visit a woolen mill to find a sightseeing outfit. She looked truly splendid in tartan. Mr. Rush wasn't really the right shape for a kilt, and Mr. Silly got into a tangle with his, a tartan tangle. The next day they drove to Glasgow to visit the Kelvin Grove Art Gallery and Museum. They saw so many things. There was an elephant and an Egyptian mummy and paintings and sculptures and dinosaur skeletons and suits of armour, and there was even an aeroplane hanging from the ceiling. Mr. Rush rushed round and saw everything. Mr. Lazy saw a lot less. After exploring the gallery, Little Miss Greedy wanted to visit the cafe. "You should try a haggis," suggested Mr. Clever. "It's a Scottish cow," said Mr. Nonsense. "No, no, no," cried Mr. Clever. "It's a food, like a giant sausage." "A giant sausage?" said Mr. Nonsense. "Don't be ridiculous." But of course Mr. Clever was right, and little Miss Greedy enjoyed her haggis, and then she enjoyed another one, and another one. It was time to head to the games. On the way, little Miss Curious spotted a Highland cow. "Now that's a haggis," announced Mr. Nonsense, which was, of course, nonsense. "It looks like a mini woolly mammoth," laughed little Miss Sunshine. "It's as shaggy as Mr. Clumsy, but not as clumsy." "Ow!" cried Mr. Clumsy, who had sat on a thistle. Mr. Clever insisted on a quick stop at the St. Andrew's Golf Club, one of the oldest in the world. "Scotland is the home of golf," announced Mr. Clever. Mr. Clever knew an awful lot about the history of golf. He knew an awful lot about the rules of golf. There was only one thing he did not know about golf: how to play. There was one last place to visit before the games, a very long lake called Loch Ness. It was even longer than Mr. Tickle's arms, which were as wiggly as Nessie, the Loch Ness monster. Many people think that Nessie is a Scottish myth and doesn't exist. But if that is true, then who is Mr. Tickle tickling? The next day they arrived at the Highland Games. The games opened with a marching band of pipers and drummers. Mr. Noisy had never heard bagpipes before. He was very impressed. Mr. Quiet was not so impressed. There were all sorts of games to watch and all sorts of games to join in. There was the Highland dancing competition for little Miss Somersault. There was the tug of war for Mr. Greedy. Nobody could move him. And there was the hammer throw for little Miss Dotty, although her hammer didn't count. And then it was the caber tossing event. Mr. Strong's moment had arrived. Mr. Strong took a long run up, and then, with all his might, he launched the caber into the air. It rose into the sky. Tumbling end over end, it landed far down the field. With a loud crack, it split in two. Mr. Strong had snapped his caber. He was too strong even for caber tossing, which made him the strongest man in the world. Mr. Strong was very pleased. And then it was time to go home. As the train pulled out of the station, there was a terrible noise from the back of the carriage. "Oh, help!" cried Mr. Jerry in terror. "The wheels have fallen off, the carriage has derailed, the train is going to crash." But it was none of these things. It was Mr. Noisy. He had bought a souvenir. Bagpipes! If you enjoyed this book, please do hit subscribe below, and you can send us any requests, just like this one. One of our fans requested Mr. Men Go to Scotland. So we'd love to hear from you about any books you'd like us to do. Thanks very much. See you soon. Mr. Men Adventure in the Ice Age by Roger Hargreaves. Mr. Snow had decided to take his friends on a fishing trip. However, Mr. Snow's idea of a fishing trip was very different to what you might imagine. Mr. Snow took everyone ice fishing at the North Pole. They knew they were there when they saw a polar bear. Look, they're at the North Pole. The first thing they had to do when they reached the North Pole was make a hole in the ice. It was very thick ice. And it was
hole?
That's a hole in the ice. And
somebody made a hole in the ice.
Somebody made a hole in the ice. And it was very hard work for some people. "This is not much of a holiday," grumbled Mr. Grumpy. Look, he's all grumpy about having to dig a hole in the ice. The fishing trip was not going well. The fish were not biting, and the frost was nipping at their toes. Everyone was freezing. They all had red noses. Even the walrus was a bit chilly. Everyone except for Mr. Snow, of course. "I think it's time to go home," grumbled Mr. Grumpy. But as they set out, it began to snow. It snowed and snowed and snowed. Soon they were driving through a blizzard. There was so much snow that the snowmobiles got stuck. "What's that?" cried Little Miss Helpful suddenly. A huge shape was lumbering towards them through the falling snow. "Oh my goodness!" exclaimed Little Miss Helpful. "That's What do you think that is?"
Walrus.
A walrus. It could be a walrus, couldn't he? A woolly mammoth. And it was indeed a woolly mammoth. A woolly mammoth. Mr. Snow and his friends had driven into the Ice Age. "There's only one thing to do," said Mr. Snow. "We will have to ride the mammoth to safety." Fortunately, the friendly mammoth was happy to oblige. They all climbed onto its back and set off through the snow. Look at them all sitting on the woolly mammoth's back. How nice is that? And there they are. Oh my gosh, Mr. Bump's being picked up by the woolly mammoth's trunk. "Look, there's a light in the distance," cried Little Miss Whoops, and promptly fell off the mammoth. Luckily, the mammoth caught her with its trunk and gave her a helping hand back on board. Or was that a helping trunk? That was Little Miss Whoops, not Mr. Bump. The light in the distance turned out to be a fire in a cave full of cavemen. "Ugh, ugh, og," said a caveman. Nobody knew what he was saying. Then suddenly, Mr. Clever started talking to the cavemen. Mr. Clever is so clever he could learn a new language in 5 minutes flat. They had been invited to dinner. There they all are. Oh, look, they're going on a sled. And that sled is being pulled by Mr. Strong. When they woke the next morning... Oh, did we miss a page? No. When they woke the next morning, it had stopped snowing, but the mammoth had wandered off in the night. How were they going to get home? It was Mr. Snow who had an idea. He found some old mammoth tusks in the cave, and using these as runners, he made a large sledge. It is very lucky that Mr. Strong is very strong. As they travelled across the vast white landscape, they felt totally alone. However, they were not alone. There was something else out there, something else that was hungry, something else that was looking for breakfast. A saber-toothed tiger! The saber-toothed tiger came bounding through the snow after them. "Help!" shrieked Little Miss Helpful as Mr. Strong sped up, but he could see a problem ahead.
Ouch!
They had reached the sea. There was nowhere to go. They were trapped. Oh, saber-toothed tigers got them. With his mighty strength, Mr. Strong pulled the sledge to a stop, and they all stood on the ice shelf at the edge of the sea. Then, using his impressive weight, Mr. Greedy jumped jumped up and down and broke off the ice they were standing on. Just in the nick of time, they floated out of the reach of the saber-toothed tiger. Luckily, saber-toothed tigers can't swim. The friends drifted through a sea of icebergs. "It's a shame we lost our fishing rods," said Mr. Snow. "We could have caught a fish." "I don't think I want to catch an Ice Age fish," said Little Miss Scary with a shudder. They floated on until they reached a glacier where they could see green fields and woods below. They had nearly escaped the Ice Age, but the glacier was a towering wall of ice with seemingly no way down. It was Mr. Tickle's extraordinarily long arms that came to the rescue this time. He was able to lower everyone from one ice ledge to another until they safely reached the bottom. Look at this. They're going all the way down. There's a big vulture up there looking down to see what they're doing. Or is that a dodo?
No, that's the rover.
Oh. Oh, they're out of the ice age now. They were very relieved to have left the ice age, and much warmer. Mr. Strong was warmer, Little Miss Helpful was warmer, Mr. Clever was warmer, and Mr. Snow was too hot. It had not been a very successful fishing trip. They had not caught anything, except for one person, Mr. Grumpy.
Mummy.
Mr. Grumpy had caught a cold. Achoo! If you enjoyed this book, please do hit subscribe. We've got plenty more Mr. Men books, and we've even got a Mr. Men playlist you can look up. Thank you. Welcome to Books for Kids by Flying Dragons. Tonight we're reading Mr. Men Go Swimming by Roger Hargreaves. There are lots of places that you can go swimming. You can swim in the sea. You can swim in the river. But you cannot swim in the bath. Mr. Tickle decided to learn to swim in a swimming pool. He arrived at the pool and went into the changing rooms. Mr. Dizzy was there for a swim, but being Mr. Dizzy, he was putting on a scarf and gloves. He had been told that the water was a bit cold. Silly old Mr. Dizzy. As you know, Mr. Tickle has extraordinarily long arms, and it turned out that extraordinarily long arms do not make swimming easy. First of all, he tried breaststroke. Then Mr. Clever showed him overarm stroke. And Little Miss Wire suggested backstroke. But for all Mr. Tickle's attempts, he could not learn to swim. So Mr. Tickle decided to sit and watch everybody else to see what he could learn. He watched Mr. Rush surging up and down the pool. He watched Little Miss Somersault diving from the high board. And he watched Little Miss Naughty bombing Little Miss Tiny. Of course, Mr. Tickle, being Mr. Tickle, he could not just sit and watch. He could not resist a tickle or two. He tickled Little Miss Splendid off her lilo. He tickled Little Miss Shy to the surface. And he tickled Mr. Worry into the pool. But how was he going to learn to swim? And then he had an idea. Armbands. But not just 2 armbands. Oh no, not with arms as long as Mr. Tickle's. Mr. Tickle needed 3 armbands for each arm, which were very helpful for swimming. Very helpful for swimming, but absolutely no good for tickling. The armbands kept getting in the way. If you liked this video, hit subscribe below. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Welcome to Books for Kids, read aloud by Flying Dragons. Tonight we're reading Mr. Men Go to the Doctor by Roger Hargreaves. Dr. Make-You-Well was having a very busy week. Little Miss Dotty had been in with the chicken pox and looked dotty and spotty all at the same time. Mr. Worry had worried that he had chicken pox too, but it turned out to be a spot of strawberry jam. Mr. Bump had bumped his head, and his foot, and his thumb. Mr. Forgetful had been in, but he could not remember what was wrong, so he went home, where he remembered what was wrong, and went back to the doctor when he promptly forgot again. This went on for quite a long time. Mr. Nosy had been to see the doctor with a bee sting. And Dr. Make-You-Well had needed to dress a cut on Mr. Tall's knee. It was a very busy week indeed. In fact, Dr. Make-You-Well was so busy that she decided she needed some help. She needed a nurse. And it just so happened that later that day she met someone who seemed like just the right person, Little Miss Helpful. However, as you may know, Little Miss Helpful was nowhere near as helpful as her name suggests. She wanted to help. She tried to help, but somehow or other things always went wrong, as Dr. Make-You-Well discovered only too soon. Mr. Sneeze came into the surgery with hay fever. Little Miss Helpful brought him some flowers from the garden to make him feel better, which of course had quite the opposite effect. Mr. Rush came in with a rash. Little Miss Helpful got her tubes muddled up and applied toothpaste rather than ointment, which did not help at all. Little Miss Chatterbox came in with a cough, and Little Miss Helpful put a bandage on her mouth. She put the whole of Mr. Tickle's arm in plaster when he had only sprained his wrist. And Little Miss Helpful's cure for Mr. Jelly's earache did nothing to help Mr. Jelly's nerves. It was chaos. Dr. Make-You-Well was twice as busy as before, putting everything right. She was exhausted when she finally got home that evening, and then the phone rang. "What now?" "Oh," she sighed. It was Little Miss Helpful. "I've caught a cold," said Little Miss Helpful. "I'm so sorry I can't come into work tomorrow." "I do hope you feel better soon," said Dr. Make-You-Well, and she put down the phone and breathed a sigh of relief. "Now that's just what the doctor would have ordered," she said to herself. If you liked this video, subscribe below. Thank you. Welcome to Books for Kids, read by Flying Dragons. This morning we're reading Mr. Quiet by Roger Hargreaves, a Mr. Men book. Mr. Quiet liked the quiet life. He lived in a small little village in the middle of a wood. The problem was that small little cottage was in the middle of a wood, in the middle of a country called Loudland. Everything and everybody in Loudland was noisy. Oh, the noise. Dogs didn't go woof, like dogs you know. They went, take a deep breath, woof. People didn't shut their doors like you or I would shut our doors. They slammed them. Bang. People didn't talk to each other. They shouted at each other. "Hello!" they'd shout as they met in the street. And you've heard about something being as quiet as a mouse, haven't you? Not in Loudland. They had the noisiest mice in the world. Squeak, squeak! They'd roar at each other.
Raining.
Mr. Noisy
Raining.
would have liked living in Loudland. He'd have loved it, but Mr. Quiet didn't. Noise frightened him, so he stayed in his cottage in the middle of his wood as much as he could.
Oh.
But of course, he couldn't stay there all the time. Every week, for instance, he had to go shopping. He used to creep into the grocer's shop. "Good morning," bellowed the grocer. "What can I do for you?" "Please," whispered Mr. Quiet, "could I have some cornflakes, please?" "What?" "Cornflakes, please," he whispered. "Speak up!" Mr. Quiet tried his loudest whisper. "Cornflakes." "Can't hear you," shouted the grocer. "Next, please." And poor Mr. Quiet had to creep away without any cornflakes. It wasn't fair, was it? He crept into the butcher's. "Please," he whispered, "I'd like some meat." The butcher didn't even hear him. He was humming to himself loudly and fiercely. Mr. Quiet tried again. "Please," he whispered, "I'd like some meat." The butcher started to whistle. It sounded more like a burglar alarm than a whistle. Mr. Quiet fled, empty-handed. It often happened, which probably explains why he was so little. Poor Mr. Quiet. He sat at home that night with a feeling of despair. "Whatever am I to do?" he thought. "It's no use," he thought. "I'll just have to try again." And so the following day he went shopping again. But the same thing happened. "Can't hear you," thundered the grocer. "Next, please." "Can't hear you," bellowed the greengrocer. "Next, please." "Can't hear you," roared the milkman. "Next, please." "Can't hear you," boomed the butcher. "Next, please." Oh dear. Poor Mr. Quiet went home and went to bed, hungry. The next morning he was awakened by a noise which sounded like bombs dropping. It was the Loudman postman knocking at Mr. Quiet's door. Bang, 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 bang. Mr. Quiet went and opened the door. "Morning," shouted the postman. "Letter for you." Mr. Quiet took the letter into his kitchen. He sat down to open it. He waited until the noise of the postman's footsteps died away. Clump, 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 clump. Mr. Quiet opened the letter in great excitement. He'd never had a letter before. It was from Mr. Happy in Happyland. An invitation to stay. Mr. Quiet was overjoyed. He rushed upstairs and packed his bag and set off that very morning. It was late when he arrived on Mr. Happy's doorstep. He knocked on Mr. Happy's door. Tap, tap, tap. Mr. Happy opened the door. "Hello," he smiled. "I thought I heard something. You must be Mr. Quiet. Well, don't just stand there. Come in and have some supper." It was the first proper meal Mr. Quiet had had for months, and while he was eating, he told Mr. Happy all about the problems he'd been having in Loudland. Mr. Happy was most sympathetic. Over breakfast the following morning, Mr. Happy told Mr. Quiet that he'd been thinking about his problem. "I think," he said, "that under the circumstances you'd better stay here in Happyland." Mr. Quiet's face lit up. "And," continued Mr. Happy, "we'll find you a house, and," he went on, "a job." Mr. Quiet's face dropped. "I'm not very good at jobs," he confessed, "because I'm too quiet." "Ah," smiled Mr. Happy, "I have the very job for a quiet chap like you." And so the very next day, Mr. Quiet started work, and he loves it. Do you know where he works? In the Happy Lending Library. As you know, everyone who goes into a library has to be very quiet, and only whispering is allowed. What a clever idea of Mr. Happy's, wasn't it? And these days Mr. Quiet is as happy as can be. While only the other day, do you know what he did on his way home from work? He was so happy he laughed out loud. Can you imagine? Tee-hee-hee! Next, please. Thank you for listening. If you like this video, subscribe below. See you soon.
Welcome to Books for Kids by Flying Dragons. Today we're reading Mr. Men in London by Roger Hargreaves. Mr. Busy decided to take all his friends on a trip to London. Everyone was very excited. They could not wait to see the sights. Mr. Topsy-Turvy looked at the tube map to see where they were going to go. However, Mr. Uppity, being the uppity fellow he is, refused to go on the Underground. Mr. Uppity likes to travel alone, so he hired a private car to chauffeur him around London, which was rather rude of him, but then he is the rudest man in the world. Mr. Busy was far too busy to notice. He and his friends got off the tube at Covent Garden and began their tour with a visit to the London Transport Museum. They saw lots of buses and trains. There were old ones and new ones. Little Miss Naughty had fun on a bus. Toot toot! Poor Mr. Jelly. After the museum, everyone got back on the tube to travel to Buckingham Palace. Little Miss Splendid wanted to see if their house was as splendid as the Queen's. Mr. Tall really is very tall. Buckingham Palace was very grand, much grander than Little Miss Splendid's house. Mr. Small joined in the changing of the guards. Mr. Small really is very small. Then, back down to the Underground they all went, and Mr. Muddle got very muddled on the escalators. He got his muddled up with his down? Or is that his down muddled down with his up? What a muddle! They got off the tube at Leicester Square. Little Miss Giggles loved all the theatres and bright lights. Mr. Noisy liked the lions in Trafalgar Square. He is as loud as a lion. Then suddenly Mr. Busy ran across the square. "Look out, Mr. Bump!" cried Mr. Busy, but it was too late. Mr. Bump had fallen into a fountain. Splash! On the bus to the Houses of Parliament, Mr. Tickle could not resist a tickle, or two, or three, and the mischief he did not stop there. At Big Ben, Mr. Mischief climbed out onto the clock face and changed the time. Tee-hee-hee, he chuckled mischievously to himself. And Mr. Busy, looking up at the clock, thought they were running late. "Quick, quick!" he cried. "Everyone on the boat, hurry up, Mr. Slow!" They sailed down the River Thames and under Tower Bridge. "What is that?" asked Little Miss Splendid, looking up into the sky. "Is it a bird? Is it a plane?" "No," said Mr. Busy. "It's Mr. Bounce. Just look how high Mr. Bounce can bounce." Finally, they reached the Tower of London. Mr. Topsy-Turvy did not get off onto the quay, but he did get off the boat. Splash! Oh dear. They had a fascinating tour of the Tower of London. Mr. Strong liked the suits of armour. Everyone was very impressed. Everyone except for Little Miss Splendid. She did not quite feel so splendid after seeing the crown jewels. And then it was time to go home. Mr. Busy and his friends caught the bus. It had been a long day. Mr. Busy, busy sort of day, and everyone was very tired, but very happy. Well, not quite everyone. Everyone except Mr. Uppity, who had spent the day fixing a puncture. The end. If you like this video, please subscribe down below. There are plenty more videos on this channel. Welcome to Books for Kids by Flying Dragons. Mr. Men, Chinese New Year by Roger Hargreaves. Little Miss Neat was very busy cleaning her house. It was the day before Chinese New Year, and this was Little Miss Neat's favourite day of the year. Spring cleaning day. She wanted to clean away all last year's bad luck, and as we all know, Little Miss Neat loves to clean. She even vacuumed the walls. There were lots of things she had to do to make sure that her New Year party went well. Little Miss Neat had asked her friends to help her decorate her house for New Year. Little Miss Sunshine put out the flowers, and Little Miss Lucky hung the paper cutouts for happiness, and Mr. Tall hung the lanterns high up in the tree, very high up. And then Mr. Wrong hung the lucky Chinese poems upside down, which turned out to be the right way up, because it was lucky to hang them upside down. It's not often that Mr. Wrong gets something right. Red is a good luck colour for the Chinese New Year, and Little Miss Neat made sure there were lots of red in her house. For extra luck, Mr. Silly got out the red paint and painted the doormat. and Little Miss Neat did not think this was very lucky. What a mess! Little Miss Splendid used the coming celebration as an excuse to buy a new hat, a truly splendid red hat. Everyone was very excited when they arrived for New Year's Eve dinner that evening. It was an enormous feast. Mr. Greedy grinned in pleasure and tucked in. He ate the beef and the pork and the vegetables and the chicken. He ate everything. He even ate all the fish. Little Miss Neat was not very happy because it was a Chinese New Year's custom to leave some of the fish. Greedy old Mr. Greedy. Each new year was represented by a different animal. There were 12 animals, and Little Miss Naughty was born in the year of the rat. After dinner, she crept up behind Little Miss Shy, wearing a red rat mask. Little Miss Shy screamed and leapt in the air. She was so embarrassed, and she turned bright red. "You'll have luck all year," laughed Little Miss Lucky. The next day, Mr. Muddle led the dragon dance down the street. Unfortunately, what followed Mr. Muddle's lead was a terrible mixed-up muddle. After this, everyone gave each other a red envelope with a gift of money inside. Everyone, well, not quite everyone. Every time Mr. Mean tried to give away his red envelope, he just could not quite bring himself to do it. He truly is the meanest man in the world. On the last day of the New Year celebrations, Little Miss Neat invited all her friends round to her garden. She had bought lots of fireworks because the loud bangs would chase away all the bad luck for the next year. But she had not counted on Mr. Bump. Mr. Bump is not a very lucky person. In fact, he is not lucky at all. While he was carrying the fireworks, he somehow or other managed to trip, and he somehow or other managed to drop all the fireworks into the pond. "Oh no," cried Little Miss Neat. "However, are we going to chase away next year's bad luck?" "Hello," boomed a very loud voice suddenly. It was Mr. Noisy, and, as you know, Mr. Noisy is very loud. More than loud. Enough to scare away any bad luck. Loud and red. "Now that's what I call lucky," said Little Miss Lucky. The end. If you like this video, please subscribe down below.
Welcome to Books for Kids, read by Flying Dragons. This morning we're reading Mr. Brave by Roger Hargreaves, a Mr. Men book. This is a story about Mr. Brave. Now, Mr. Brave is not as strong as Mr. Strong, and he's not as tall as Mr. Tall, but as you will soon see, that does not stop him being brave. Yeah, there's Big Mr. Tall. This story happened last Tuesday. Big Mr. Man. When little Miss Bossy rang Mr. Brave to invite him to tea. "And don't be late," she shouted down the phone.
Mr. Man falling down.
Oh, falling down, hope not. It was a very stormy day, but Mr. Brave knew that little Miss Bossy's temper was worse, so he set off for little Miss Bossy's house, hurrying along as fast as he could, to be sure that he was not late for tea. Along the way he heard a cry for help.
What's this one?
That's Mr. Messy. It was Mr. Messy. He had been blown into the river by the wind. Mr. Brave did not want to be late for little Miss Bossy. But being the brave fellow he was, he jumped into the river and rescued Mr. Messy. "Oh, thank you," said Mr. Messy. "You're so brave, Mr. Brave." Wet right through, Mr. Brave hurried on along the lane. Suddenly he heard he's got water coming off him. Suddenly he heard somebody sobbing loudly. Who could it be? It was little Miss Somersault. She was balancing on a tightrope tied between two tall trees. "Oh, Mr. Brave, I'm so lonely," she sobbed. "Nobody will come and play on my tightrope. They are all too frightened of heights." "You're so brave, Mr. Brave," she added. "Won't you come and join me?" Mr. Brave looked up at little Miss Somersault. He did not want to be late for little Miss Bossy, but being the brave fellow he was, he took pity on little Miss Somersault and climbed up onto the tightrope. They chatted away happily for a while, until Mr. Brave happened to look down. "Little Miss Somersault, look!" he cried out in panic. "The rope is going to snap. We're going to fall, and it's such a long way down. Oh, calamity! Oh, help!" "Be brave, Mr. Brave," said little Miss Somersault. And without more ado, she carried him safely back down to the ground. "Oh, thank you," said Mr. Brave with a sigh of relief. They did fall down. Little Miss Somersault said goodbye and left Mr. Brave on his own, shaking like a leaf. "I don't deserve to be called Mr. Brave," he said to himself. "I was scared stiff. Thank goodness nobody knows my secret." And nobody does know his secret. Or do they? Now, little Miss Trouble just happened to be passing, and she had seen and heard everything. And what she had seen and heard had given her an idea, a very naughty idea. She grinned a mischievous grin. "Oh, hey, come here, everybody," she shouted at the top of her voice. "Come and see this." Very quickly, a large crowd gathered. "I have an announcement," announced little Miss Trouble. "Did you know that Mr. Brave isn't brave at all?" "No, it can't be true," said the crowd all together. "It is true," said little Miss Trouble, "and I'll prove it to you. Mr. Brave," she continued, "I dare you to walk across the tightrope." Mr. Brave looked at the tightrope, and all the crowd looked at the tightrope. Then all the crowd looked at Mr. Brave. Mr. Brave suddenly remembered something, a very important something. "Just look at the time," he said. "I'm going to be late for tea at little Miss Bossy's." "Mustache!" he cried, and he ran off as quickly as possible. "Hooray!" cheered the crowd, and they all clapped and applauded Mr. Brave. Little Miss Trouble looked puzzled. "Why are you cheering him?" she cried. "He ran away. He isn't brave at all." "Oh, yes, he is," they all shouted. "Would you turn up late for tea at little Miss Bossy's?" Little Miss Trouble thought for a moment. "Gosh," he said in awe, "he is brave after all." If you enjoyed this book, please hit subscribe below. Thank you. Welcome to Books for Kids, read by Flying Dragons. This morning we're reading Mr. Messy by Roger Hargreaves, a Mr. Men book. Mr. Messy was the messiest person you've ever met in your whole life. He looked messy because he was messy in everything he did. You could always tell where Mr. Messy had been because he left a trail of messy fingerprints wherever he'd been. Oh yes, Mr. Messy was messy by name, messy by nature. Mr. Messy lived in a particularly messy-looking house. The paint was peeling, the windows were broken, there were tiles missing from the roof, the flower beds were overgrown with weeds, the garden gate was off its hinges. And had Mr. Messy cut the grass in his garden lately? He had not. One morning, Mr. Messy woke up in his messy bed, yawned, stretched, got up, cleaned his teeth, leaving the top off the toothpaste, had his breakfast, spilling cornflakes all over the floor, and set out for a walk, tripping over a brush he'd left lying in the garden 2 weeks before. There was a wood behind Mr. Messy's house, with the messy garden, and that's where he went for his walk. It was a particularly large wood with lots and lots of trees, and it took Mr. Messy a long time to walk through it. but he didn't really mind because he felt like walking that morning. So he walked and walked right through the wood until he came to the other side. And do you know what he found on the other side of the wood? Mr. Messy found the neatest, prettiest looking little cottage that he'd ever seen. It had a lovely little garden and a stream running through the middle of it. There was a man in the garden clipping the hedge. He looked up as Mr. Messy approached. "Good morning, I'm Mr. Messy," said Mr. Messy. "I can see that," replied the man, looking up and down. "I'm Mr. Tidy." "And I'm Mr. Neat," said the other man, appearing out of the house. "Tidy and neat," said Mr. Tidy. "Neat and tidy," said Mr. Neat. "We're in business together," explained Mr. Tidy, "and the people who own this house have asked us to do some work for them." "What sort of work?" asked Mr. Messy. "Oh, we make things nice and neat," said Mr. Neat. "Tidy things up," added Mr. Tidy. "Perhaps we could come along and do some work for you," said Mr. Neat, looking at Mr. Messy, who was looking even messier than usual that particular morning. "But I don't want things neat and tidy," said Mr. Messy, looking downright miserable at the thought of it. "Nonsense," said Mr. Tidy. "Fiddlesticks," said Mr. Neat. "But," said Mr. Messy. "Come along," said Mr. Neat. "Off we go," said Mr. Tidy. But, said Mr. Messy. "But nothing," said Mr. Neat, and bundling him into the van, which was parked behind the house, off they went to Mr. Messy's house at the other side of the wood. "Good heavens," said Mr. Neat, when he saw where Mr. Messy lived. "Good gracious," added Mr. Tidy. "This is the messiest house I have ever seen in all my born days," they both said together at the same time. "Better do something about it," said Mr. Neat. And before Mr. Messy could open his mouth, the two of them were rushing here and there about Mr. Messy's house. Mr. Neat hoed and mowed and pruned and snipped and clipped and cleared and dug and made the garden look neater than it had ever looked before. Mr. Tidy cleaned and primed and rubbed and painted and mended and made the outside of Mr. Messy's house look tidier than it had ever looked before. They both went inside the house. "Good heavens," said Mr. Neat for the second time that morning. "Good gracious," said Mr. Tidy for the second time that morning. And then they set about cleaning the house from top to bottom. They brushed and swept and polished and scrubbed and made the inside of the house look neater and tidier than it had ever looked before. "There we are," said Mr. Tidy. "All finished," said Mr. Neat. "Tidy and neat," said Mr. Tidy. "Neat and tidy," said Mr. Neat. Mr. Messy just didn't know what to say. Then they both looked at Mr. Messy. "Are you thinking what I'm thinking?" Mr. Neat said to Mr. Tidy. "Precisely," replied Mr. Tidy. "What we're both thinking," they said to Mr. Messy, "is that you look much too messy to live in a neat and tidy house like this." "But," said Mr. Messy. But whatever Mr. Messy said was no use, and Mr. Neat and Mr. Tidy whisked him off to the bathroom upstairs. It had been the messiest room in the house, but now, of course, it was neat as a new pin. Then Mr. Neat got hold of one of Mr. Messy's arms, and Mr. Tidy got hold of the other arm, and they picked him up and put him straight into the bath. Mr. Messy wasn't used to having baths. Mr. Neat and Mr. Tidy washed and brushed and cleaned and scrubbed and combed Mr. Messy until he didn't look like Mr. Messy at all. In fact, he looked the opposite of messy. He looked at himself in the mirror. "You know what I'm going to have to do now?" he said in a rather fierce voice. Mr. Neat and Mr. Tidy looked worried. "What are you going to have to do?" they asked Mr. Messy. "I'm going to have to change my name," said Mr. Messy, and he chuckled. And Mr. Neat and Mr. Tidy chuckled. And then Mr. Messy laughed, and Mr. Neat and Mr. Tidy laughed, and then they all laughed together and became the best of friends. And that really is the end of the story, except to say that if you're a messy sort of person, you might have to have a visit from two people. And you know what they're called, don't you? Thank you for listening. If you like this video, subscribe below. See you soon. Welcome to Books for Kids, Read Aloud by Flying Dragons. Today we're reading Mr. Lazy, a Mr. Men book by Roger Hargreaves.
A food.
Oh. Mr. Lazy lives in Sleepyland, which is a very lazy-looking and sleepy-like place. The birds in Sleepyland fly so slowly they sometimes fall out of the sky. The grass takes so long to grow, it only needs cutting once a year. Even the trees are lazy looking and sleepy like. And do you know what time everybody gets up in Sleepyland? The answer is they don't get up in the morning. They get up in the afternoon. And incidentally, this is what a Sleepyland clock looks like. Everything takes so long, there's only time for 4 hours a day. Anyway, this story starts with Mr. Lazy being fast asleep in bed. In Sleepyland, they call that being slow asleep. He spends rather a lot of time in bed. It's his favourite place to be. He opened his eyes, yawned again, and went back to sleep. Later, Mr. Lazy opened his eyes again, yawned again, and went back to sleep again. Much later, Mr. Lazy got up and went to make his breakfast. We say breakfast, although really it was tea time. I know, he's falling down, isn't he? His nose is getting all the way down. We say breakfast, although really it was tea time. He put the kettle on to make some tea. Kettles take 2 hours to boil in Sleepyland. Then he toasted a slice of bread. Bread takes 3 hours to go brown in Sleepyland. Toast never gets burnt there. While he was waiting for his kettle to boil and his bread to toast, Mr. Lazy went into the garden of Yawn Cottage, which was where he lived. He sat down on a chair, and you can probably guess what happened next. That's right, he yawned and yawned again and went to sleep. Suddenly, he woke up with a jump, which is something that doesn't happen very often to Mr. Lazy. And the reason he woke with a jump was because of the noise. "Wake up," said the noise. "Wake up, wake up, wake up." There were 2 men standing in front of him. "I'm Mr. Busy," said one of the men. "And I'm Mr. Bustle," said the other. "Come along now," said Mr. Bustle busily. "We can't have you sleeping all day," added Mr. Busy, bustling Mr. Lazy to his feet. "But who are you?" asked Mr. Lazy. "We're Bustle and Busy," they replied. Said Mr. Lazy. "Come along now," said Mr. Busy. "We haven't got all day." "But," said Mr. Lazy. "No time for buts," said Mr. Busy. "Or ifs," added Mr. Bustle. "There's the wood to chop and the beds to make and the floors to clean and the coal to get and the windows to polish and the plates to wash and the furniture to dust and the grass to cut and the hedges to clip and the food to cook and the clothes to mend," added Mr. Busy. "Oh dear," groaned Mr. Lazy in a daze. "The wood to clean and the beds to get and the floors to cut and the coal to cook and the windows to make and the plates to mend and the furniture to chop and the grass to wash and the hedges to dust and the clothes to clip." He'd got it all completely wrong. He was in such a daze. Then Bustle and Busy set Mr. Lazy to work, chopping and making and cleaning and getting and polishing and washing and dusting and cutting and clipping and cooking and mending, not to mention all the fetching and carrying. Poor Mr. Lazy. "Now," they said when he'd finished, "it's time for a walk." And off they set on the longest walk Mr. Lazy had ever been on. Mr. Lazy is one of those people who never walks when he has a chance of sitting down, and never sits down when he has a chance of lying down. But this one day he had no choice. They made him walk for miles and miles and miles, until he felt his legs must be worn right down to his body. Poor Mr. Lazy. When they arrived back at Yawn Cottage, Mr. Busy said, "Right, now for a run." "Oh no," groaned Mr. Lazy. "Oh no." "When I blow this whistle," said Mr. Bustle, producing a whistle, "you've got to start running." "As fast as you can," added Mr. Busy. Mr. Lazy groaned a deep groan and closed his eyes. Mr. Bustle put the whistle to his lips. "Whee!" whistled the whistle. "Whee!" went the whistle. Mr. Lazy, poor Mr. Lazy, started to run, but his legs weren't getting him anywhere. He opened his eyes and looked down to see why. and the reason his legs weren't getting him anywhere was because he was sitting on a chair in the garden. And there was no sign of Mr. Busy and Mr. Bustle. It had all been a terrible dream. And the whistle was the whistle kettle boiling in the kitchen. Mr. Lazy heaved a sigh of relief, and then he went into the kitchen and sat down to have his breakfast and to think about his dream. But you know what happened next, don't you? Wake up, Mr. Lazy! Wake up, wake up, wake up! If you enjoyed this book, please hit subscribe below. Thank you.
Thank you.
Welcome to Books for Kids, read by Flying Dragons. Today we're reading Mr. Cool, a Mr. Men book by Roger Hargreaves. Poor Jack Robinson wasn't feeling very well. He had been in bed for days and he had to stay in bed until he was better. "I'm bored," he huffed. "I wish I could go outside and play with my friends." Suddenly, a blue blur shot in through the open window. It looped the loop around the light in the ceiling, and a small blue figure wearing a hat landed on the end of Jack's bed. "Cool," said Jack. "That's me, Mr. Cool," said Mr. Cool. "Cool," repeated Jack. "You look a bit bored," said Mr. Cool. "I thought we could go and have some fun." "I wish I could," said Jack, "but I'm not allowed out of bed." "I think we could make an exception just this once," said Mr. Cool, and he clicked his fingers. The next instant, Jack found himself sitting in the cockpit of a jet plane. "Why don't you take it out for a spin?" suggested Mr. Cool. "What? Can I really fly in it?" said Jack. "Sure you can," said Mr. Cool. "It's easy." So Jack flew the jet plane out across the Atlantic Ocean and back. "Oh, that was cool," cried Jack when they were back on the ground. "Thanks, Mr. Cool." "We haven't finished yet," said Mr. Cool, and he clicked his fingers again. Jack heard a crowd roar. He was at a football ground, but he wasn't sitting in the crowd. He was on the bench with the other players, and he was even wearing the team strip. "Quick," said Mr. Cool, "the manager wants you to go on." "He wants me to play?" said Jack incredulously. "But they're Capital United." And you'll never guess what? Jack scored the winning goal. "Wow, that was cool," said Jack. As Jack walked off the pitch, Mr. Cool clicked his fingers and whisked them away. To climb the tallest tree in the world. He clicked his fingers again, and before you could say Jack Robinson, they were standing on top of a mountain. "Where are we?" called Jack over the noise of the wind. "Mount Everest," said Mr. Cool. "How cool! What are we doing here?" shouted Jack. "Sledging," said Mr. Cool. "Let's go." Jack and Mr. Cool slid from the very top to the very bottom of Mount Everest. "That was the coolest thing ever," cried Jack. "It was more like the coldest," stuttered Mr. Cool. For the final time that day, Mr. Cool clicked his fingers. In an instant, Jack found himself back in his bedroom. "Thank you so much, Mr. Cool," said Jack. "That was amazing," laughed Mr. Cool. "Well, I'll be off," said Mr. Cool. "But there's one more thing, Jack. Have a look in the mirror." With this, Mr. Cool shot out through the open window. Jack went into the bathroom and looked in the mirror. "Cool," said Jack when he saw himself. "And why do you think Jack was so pleased? That's right, all his spots had gone. Jack was better. I wonder, on which page did Jack get better? Did you spot it? If you enjoyed this book, please click to subscribe below.
No.
Thank you.
That one.
That one now.
Welcome to Books for Kids by Flying Dragons. Mr. Men Go to School by Roger Hargreaves. Little Miss Tiny was very excited. It was her first day at school. She was so excited she woke up extra early. And she got to school so early that it was not even open when she arrived. The only other person there was Little Miss Late. But she was not early. She was late. A whole term late. When everyone else got there, they had to hang their bags on their pegs. Mr. Muddle's bag was so heavy that it bent his peg. And why was it so heavy? Mr. Muddle had brought a stack full of rocks to school. A rock sack rather than a rucksack. What a muddly old muddle he is in. Little Miss Tiny was looking forward to learning lots of new things at school. Her teacher was Little Miss Sunshine. Little Miss Tiny gave her an apple. But before Little Miss Sunshine could say thank you, Mr. Greedy had gobbled it up. In one bite. Crunch! Little Miss Tiny had learned her first lesson of the day. Don't leave food within Mr. Greedy's reach. The first proper lesson of the day was writing. Little Miss Tiny very carefully copied the letters Little Miss Sunshine had written on the board. Unlike Mr. Messy. And then it was story time. Read by Little Miss Chatterbox. Who knew how to make a short story long? Very, very, very long. Little Miss Tiny was rather glad to escape out into the playground at break time. She had a great time on the slide and in the sandpit, and she made a friend, Mr. Small. He was almost the same size as Mr. Greedy's snack. And then it was painting time. Little Miss Sunshine asked them to paint their favourite thing. Little Miss Tiny painted a daisy. Little Miss Dotty painted lots of dots. And Mr. Topsy-Turvy painted his cat. And Mr. Greedy painted a sausage. Little Miss Tiny was very happy at lunchtime. She got to sit next to Mr. Small. They had a tiny portion and a small portion to eat, half a sausage and 5 peas each. After lunch, it was show and tell. Little Miss Naughty had brought her rubber spider. Little Miss Bossy, the headmistress, was not happy. Not happy at all. Little Miss Tiny was very happy when they went on to maths. Little Miss Sunshine had written a sum on the board. "What is 2 plus 2?" she asked. Little Miss Tiny was about to answer 4, but someone answered before her. 2 plus 2 equals 573.1 and 2 halves, cried Mr. Wrong. Oh dear, Mr. Wrong gets something wrong. He gets it really, really wrong. And then it was time for games. Mr. Silly was their PE teacher. Nobody could work out what sport they were supposed to be playing, but it was great fun. Little Miss Tiny was rather sad when the bell rang for the end of school, and that night, as she lay in bed, she remembered all the fun things she had done that day. And the next day, she remembered something else. She remembered to take 2 apples to school, one for her teacher, and one for Mr. Greedy. Crunch! If you like this video, please subscribe down below. There are lots more videos on this channel, so please go explore.
Welcome to Books for Kids. This afternoon we're reading Mr. Bump by Roger Hargreaves, a Mr. Men book. This is the sad story of Mr. Bump. The trouble was that Mr. Bump just could not help having little accidents. If there was something for Mr. Bump to bump into, he'd bump into it all right. For instance, if you were to see Mr. Bump out walking or down a street in your town, and if there happened to be something to bump into down that street, then you know what would happen, don't you? Bump! Mr. Bump was just the same at home. He lived in an extremely nice home, but even there he couldn't help having those little accidents. For instance, one morning when Mr. Bump went outside his house, he noticed that the chimney pot had come loose in a storm the night before. "I must fix that before it falls off," thought Mr. Bump to himself, and he hurried to his garden shed to fetch a ladder. It was a very long ladder. Mr. Bump walked up the garden path with the ladder on his shoulder. He turned the corner of the garden path. Crash went the living room window. "Oh dear," thought Mr. Bump, and he turned to see what had happened. Crash went the kitchen window behind him. "Oh dear," thought Mr. Bump again, and he rested the ladder against the wall of the house so that he could climb up onto the roof to mend the chimney pot. Crash went the bedroom window. So you can see how Mr. Bump had his little accidents. Mr. Bump had had many jobs, but somehow they never seemed to last very long. Oh my gosh, it came off the broom. As soon as anything got lost or broken or splintered or chipped or snapped or cracked or torn or bust or wrenched or crunched or split or slit, Mr. Bump got the blame. For instance, when Mr. Bump worked on a farm, he tripped over the farm dog and spilt the milk which he was carrying for the farmer's wife, and which the farm cat lapped up. For instance, when Mr. Bump was a postman, he got his hand stuck in a pillar box, and they had to fetch the fire brigade to come and set him free. For instance, when Mr. Bump was a bus conductor, he fell off the bus and couldn't catch it up again, and all the passengers travelled without having to pay. For instance, when Mr. Bump was a carpenter, he found that when he was hammering nails, he hammered his thumb most of the time, and the nail hardly at all. In order to recover from this series of rather unfortunate happenings... Wow, a red ball. Mr. Bump decided to take a holiday. There he could think about what sort of job he could do where he wouldn't... No, don't trip over. Where he wouldn't be such a nuisance. Don't trip over. Mr. Bump might trip over, mightn't he? We're going to make sure he doesn't. Maybe. There he could think about what sort of job he could do where he wouldn't be such a nuisance to everybody. So off he set to the station to catch a train to the seaside. While Mr. Bump... Oh no, he tripped over.
Tripped over on the boat.
Oh, he did. He tripped over on the boat into the water. Yeah. While Mr. Bump was on holiday, several things happened. For instance, he fell off a boat into the sea and the lifeboat had to come and rescue him. For instance, one day when he was quietly walking along the beach, minding his own business, he got his foot stuck in a bucket, and as he couldn't get it off, he had to walk around with it on his foot for hours. For instance, another time, he was walking along the beach when he walked straight into a large hole that somebody had dug, and he had to stay there all night because he couldn't climb out on his own. However, Despite all these little accidents, Mr. Bump enjoyed his holiday, and while he was there he had a splendid idea about what sort of job he should do. It was quite the best idea Mr. Bump had ever had, an absolutely splendid idea. And now Mr. Bump works happily for Mr. Barley the farmer.
Orange.
Yeah, that's the sun. Mr. Barley has a rather large apple orchard on his farm, and that's where Mr. Bump works. Mr. Bump's job is picking apples, but he doesn't use a ladder to climb up the tree to pick the apples like other apple pickers. Oh no, Mr. Bump has a much better way of picking apples than that. He just walks about, and before long Mr. Bump, being Mr. Bump, walks into a tree. Bump! And down falls an apple, and Mr. Bump catches it. This makes the job of apple picking much easier. That's funny. And Mr. Bump is very pleased about his new job, and Mr. Barley is very pleased about his new apple picker. So you see, the story of Mr. Bump isn't such a sad story after all, and if you ever bump yourself, you know what to do, don't you? Go and eat an apple picked by Mr. Bump, and then you won't feel your bump at all. You'll remember that the next time you have a bump, won't you? Good! If you liked this video, click subscribe below. Thank you!
No.
Welcome to Books for Kids, read by Flying Dragons. This afternoon we're reading Mr. Funny and the Magic Lamp by Roger Hargreaves. Mr. Funny lives in a teapot house. How ridiculous, I hear you say. But it suited Mr. Funny right down to its spout. Now, one day, last spring, Mr. Funny discovered an old trunk in his attic, which is under the lid. And in the trunk he found a carpet that gave him a surprise. For it was a magic carpet, a magic flying carpet. Mr. Funny was very excited. There and then he decided to go on a trip to see where the magic carpet would take him. So that spring morning he set off on an adventure. Mr. Funny flew over Lazyland, where he woke up Mr. Lazy with a very loud raspberry and a funny face. Mr. Lazy laughed so much he fell out of bed. Mr. Funny and his magic carpet flew over Fatland, where Mr. Funny made Mr. Skinny laugh. He laughed so much he tripped over a daisy and dropped the breadcrumb he was carrying for his picnic lunch. And they flew over Coldland, where Mr. Funny made Mr. Sneeze laugh. He laughed so much that he stopped sneezing. The magic carpet flew on and on. They flew over mountains and valleys and over the sea. Finally, they arrived in a desert. But there was nobody there, nobody to laugh at Mr. Funny's funny faces. Then, just as he was about to leave, Mr. Funny saw something half buried in the sand. It was a lamp. What a grubby old lamp, he said to himself, and he gave it a rub. Suddenly, with a clap of thunder and a cloud of smoke, a genie appeared in front of Mr. Funny. Which was all very exciting, but what Mr. Funny noticed most of all was how miserable the genie looked. Mr. Funny had never seen anyone look so unhappy. "Master," said the genie glumly, "I am the genie of the lamp, and I will appear before you to grant 3 wishes. To the genie's surprise, Mr. Funny pulled one of his famous funny faces. But the genie did not laugh. He did not chuckle. He did not even smile. Not a flicker. "Oh dear," said Mr. Funny. It was going to take a bit more than a funny face to cheer up this genie. And then he had a thought. "For my first wish, I wish for a piano-playing elephant." "As you command, master," said the genie. And then before you could say broken piano stool, a piano-playing elephant appeared before them. Mr. Funny roared with laughter. It was hilarious. But it was not funny enough to make the genie laugh. He looked just as glum as before. Mr. Funny had another thought. "For my second wish, I wish for a mouse." And before you could say squeak, a mouse appeared. And as Mr. Funny, and you probably know, Great big elephants are frightened of teeny tiny mouse. The elephant trumpeted in fear and jumped on top of the piano, which broke under the elephant's weight. Mr. Funny laughed with delight. Now that was funny, chuckled Mr. Funny. Not really, said the genie, who looked as unhappy as before. You are a gloomy fellow, said Mr. Funny. You would be too, said the genie, if you had to live in that lamp. It must be a tight squeeze, admitted Mr. Funny. You can say that again, grumbled the genie. There's no room even to cough living in a lamp. I live in a teapot. A very comfortable teapot, mind you, said Mr. Funny. And then yet another thought struck him. For my third wish, I wish your lamp was a house. And before you could say, bring me a builder, the genie's lamp turned into a house. The genie smiled. Only a flicker of a smile, but at least a smile. That's more like it, said Mr. Funny. Now, how am I going to get this elephant back home? I know, I wish. I'm sorry, interrupted the genie. You've used up your 3 wishes. So Mr. Funny and the elephant had to squeeze onto the magic carpet for their ride home. It was quite a sight. Rather funny, in fact. So funny, the genie roared with laughter.
Now,
Thanks for listening. If you'd like this video, please subscribe below. See you soon.
no, this one.
Welcome to Books for Kids by Flying Dragons. Today we're reading Mr. Men Winter Wonderland by Roger Hargreaves. Mr. Tickle was in a hurry. He was in such a hurry that he had breakfast and made his bed all at the same time. This is the sort of thing you can only do when you have arms as long as Mr. Tickle's extraordinarily long arms. He was in a hurry because it was the day of the Winter Wonderland Christmas Fair, and Mr. Tickle loved visiting the Christmas Fair each year. It was very busy at the fair. There were crowds of people for Mr. Tickle to tickle, which was why Mr. Tickle loved going to the Christmas Fair. There were lots of stalls at the fair selling everything you could ever want for the perfect Christmas. There was a tree decoration stall, and a toy stall, and a cake stall, and a pudding stall. There was even a stocking stall. Little Miss Christmas's Christmas stockings. Silly old Mr. Silly. There was ice skating on the frozen pond. Look out, Mr. Bump. Look out, Little Miss Whoops. Look out, Clumsy. Crash. There were reindeer rides. Mr. Muddle was in his usual muddle. Poor old Rudolph. He didn't know whether he was coming or going. There were sleigh rides through the snowy woods. Jingle bells, jingle all the way. Oh, what fun it is to ride on a one-horse open sleigh. And there was Santa's grotto. Father Christmas had flown in from the North Pole with a huge sack full of presents. Mr. Bounce couldn't stay still long enough to tell Father Christmas what he wanted for Christmas. Bounce, bounce, bounce. Now, where to start? Thought Mr. Tickle. Mr. Greedy was standing at a festive treat stall busily buying gingerbread men and candy canes. Lots of gingerbread men and candy canes. In fact, all of the gingerbread men and candy canes. Mr. Tickle reached out with his extraordinarily long arms and tickled Mr. Greedy. But nothing happened. Mr. Greedy did not leap up in surprise. He did not roll around on the ground laughing. He did not react at all. Mr. Tickle was very puzzled. Mr. Tickle walked over to the Ferris wheel. Mr. Dizzy was going round and round, getting even more dizzy than usual. Mr. Tickle reached up with one of his very long arms and tickled Mr. Dizzy, but it was just the same as when he had tickled Mr. Greedy. Nothing happened. Mr. Tickle tried tickling the carol singers. Nothing. He tried to tickle the toffee apple seller. Nothing. No tickles to speak of. A complete lack of tickle, in fact. A tickleless day. Poor Mr. Tickle. Whatever could be wrong? He had lost his tickledness. And then Mr. Tickle had a thought. He looked all the long, long way along his extraordinarily long arms to his hands. Hands wearing gloves? Gloves? Of course, exclaimed Mr. Tickle. And with a large grin he took off his gloves and reached out one of those extraordinarily long arms and tickled. Now, who do you think he tickled? I'll give you a clue. He is very jolly. That's right, Father Christmas. He, chuckled Father Christmas. Ha, 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 laughed Father Christmas. And then, finally, ho, 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 boomed Father Christmas. The end. If you like this video, please subscribe down below. Welcome to Books for Kids by Flying Dragons. Mr. Men Go to the Zoo by Roger Hargreaves. It was Sunday, and little Miss Naughty had lots of jobs to do around the house. Her bed needed making, the house needed cleaning, and the garden needed weeding. So what did little Miss Naughty do? She went to the zoo. Bed making was no fun, cleaning was no fun, and weeding was no fun. But the zoo was fun. The first place that little Miss Naughty visited at the zoo was the monkey house. Little Miss Naughty liked the monkeys. They were just as naughty as she was. And as we all know, she does enjoy being naughty. But there was someone else at the zoo who also liked being naughty. Mr. Mischief. Mr. Mischief watched little Miss Naughty feed Mr. Greedy's iced buns to the elephant, which was very naughty. And this got Mr. Mischief thinking. Not to be outdone, Mr. Mischief let the lion out of his cage at feeding time. Luckily, Mr. Strong was on hand to put things right. Little Miss Naughty was rather put out. She wanted to be the naughtiest, and she had to be the naughtiest. So she fed little Miss Splendid's hat to the hippo. But, as quick as a flash, Mr. Mischief had painted stripes on the leopard. And spots on the zebra. Poor Mr. Muddle was in even more of a muddle than usual. Little Miss Naughty had to think hard. She could not let Mr. Mischief beat her. She crept into the reptile house and gave little Miss Shy a terrible shock with the hose. Hiss! Things were getting out of hand. Mr. Mischief climbed up the giraffe's neck and dropped an ice cream on the top of Mr. Tall's head. Little Miss Naughty poured food colouring in the penguin pool and turned it pink. The zoo was in chaos, and the zookeeper was very unhappy indeed. And then Mr. Mischief had little Miss Naughty decided to have an ostrich race, and the winner would be declared the naughtiest of all. And it was the naughtiest one of them who won, Mr. Mischief. He painted glue on the feet of little Miss Naughty's ostrich. And because little Miss Naughty's ostrich was so slow, the zookeeper was able to catch her in his net. As a punishment, he set her to work. He set her to work on a very big job, cleaning up behind the elephant. Maybe little Miss Naughty should have stayed at home and cleaned up her own mess. Suddenly, cleaning the house did not seem so bad after all. The end. If you like this video, please subscribe down below. There are lots more videos on the channel.
Welcome to Books for Kids, read aloud by Flying Dragons. Tonight we're reading Mr. Men, New Pet by Roger Hargreaves. Mr. Muddle was feeling rather left out. Everybody he knew had a pet. Everybody except for him. Mr. Muddle decided that he would like a pet. But what sort of animal should he choose? Now, some of his friends had pets that suited them right down to the ground. Little Miss Chatterbox had a parrot, and she and her parrot chatted all day long and all night long. Mr. Quiet had a goldfish, and they both lived very happily in silence. And Mr. Bounce had a kangaroo. He did not take his kangaroo for a walk. Oh no, he and his kangaroo went for a daily bounce. Some of Mr. Muddle's friends had pets that did not suit them at all. Mr. Sneeze owned a very fluffy cat, which made him sneeze. Mr. Worry had a tiger, which was not good for his nerves. And little Miss Quick had a tortoise. And then some of Mr. Muddle's friends had just got things all wrong. Like Mr. Topsy-Turvy, who had made a very topsy-turvy hutch for his rabbit. Like little Miss Scatterbrain, who remembered to exercise her dog every day, but wasn't sure who was walking who. And like Mr. Wrong, who thought he'd provided everything his hamster needed. It had a cage with sawdust, food and water every day, and a hamster wheel, but for some reason the hamster wheel wouldn't go round. Mr. Muddle wanted to make sure that he picked just the right pet for himself, but he was all in a muddle. There were so many pets to choose from at the pet shop. He could not make up his mind. It was Mr. Nonsense who came to Mr. Muddle's aid. Mr. Nonsense lived in Nonsense Land, a place where the grass is blue and greenhouses are green. Mr. Nonsense had a pet banana. You should get a puppy, suggested Mr. Nonsense to Mr. Muddle.
Pet banana.
Pet banana. A puppy sounds like a very sensible suggestion, doesn't it? But how might a puppy suit Mr. Muddle? Mr. Muddle followed Mr. Nonsense's advice and bought a puppy for himself. A very cute puppy.
Jumping up and down.
Jumping up and down. A very cute puppy. A puppy with a tail that wagged. A puppy with a cold, wet nose. A puppy that, when you rubbed its tummy, went moo. It was a Nonsense Land puppy. A muddled up Nonsense Land puppy. And it suited Mr. Muddle. Okay. And it suited Mr. Muddle right down to the ground and all the way up to the sky, where a bird was flying by. Moo! Woof! Said the bird. Oh, that's very silly, isn't it? Thank you for listening. If you liked this video, subscribe below. See you soon. Mr. Men at Bedtime by Roger Hargreaves. Read by Books for Kids by Flying Dragons. There are lots of different ways to go to sleep. Little Miss Giggles likes to giggle herself to sleep. Little Miss Chatterbox likes to talk herself to sleep. And Mr. Tickle likes to tickle himself to sleep. Every night it takes Mr. Greedy a very long time to go to sleep. After cleaning his teeth, he gets into bed and then he reads his book. Suddenly his tummy rumbles. He is peckish. He gets up, goes downstairs, makes himself a sandwich, eats his sandwich, goes back upstairs, brushes his teeth again, gets into bed again, and opens his book again. Just as he is dropping off to sleep, his tummy rumbles again. Back downstairs, another snack, back upstairs, teeth cleaned and into bed and book opened again. And I'm sure you know what happens next.
Mummy.
Another rumble. So you see, it takes Mr. Greedy a very long time to go to sleep. Finally, after a 9 o'clock and a 10 o'clock and an 11 o'clock and a midnight snack, his tummy is satisfied. Mr. Greedy has very clean teeth. Mr. Lazy, on the other hand, takes a very short time to go to bed. He is already there because he never got up in the first place. Little Miss Busy never gets to bed. Every time she starts to climb the stairs, she thinks of one last thing to do. But it's never the last thing to do. It's only ever the next thing to do, all night long. And talking of long, have you seen how long Mr. Tall's bed is? And how narrow Mr. Skinny's bed is? And how short little Miss Tiny's bed is? But little Miss Dotty sleeps in the strangest bed. She sleeps in her flower bed. What a muddy bed. Mr. Silly likes a bath in jelly before bedtime. What a sticky bath. Of course, Mr. Messy does not have a bath. He does not make his bed. He does not even clean his teeth. Yuck! Mr. Perfect has perfectly clean teeth. So clean you can see them when he turns the light out. Mr. Jelly does not turn his light out. He has a nightlight. He is afraid of the dark. He is also afraid of bed bugs that bite and things that go bump in the night. Poor Mr. Jelly. Isn't he silly? One thing that goes bump in the night is Mr. Bump, falling out of bed. Bump, 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 all night long. Mr. Wrong, on the other hand, never gets into bed. He gets into his wardrobe. That's a bit silly. So there are lots of different ways to go to sleep.
Sleeping boat.
He is in a sleeping boat. Some of them I would not suggest you try. But always remember one thing. Don't have a sleepover with Mr. Tickle. It won't be bedtime. It will be tickle time. If you enjoyed this book, please do hit subscribe. We've got plenty more Mr. Men books and a Mr. Men playlist.
Welcome to Books for Kids by Flying Dragons. Mr. Men on the Farm by Roger Hargreaves. Mr. Silly was very excited. He had just bought a farm. He had always wanted to be a farmer. Farmer Silly. And on his farm he had some cows and sheep and pigs and a duck pond and chickens and an orchard and lots of fields.
And a cat.
And a cat, that's right. The only problem was that Mr. Silly had no idea how to be a farmer. Not a clue. He was so clueless that on his first day he fed cornflakes to the cows. Cornflakes? Have you ever heard of anything quite so daft? And there was more. He put the pig in the hen house and it got stuck. He filled the duck pond with custard and the ducks all flew away. He trained the farm cat to herd the sheep. A sheep cat? What nonsense! All the sheep escaped. And he trained the sheepdog to collect the eggs, which was possibly an even worse idea. Mr. Silly trying to plough his own field was definitely an even worse idea. Finally, he picked the apples in the orchard with a saw. By the end of his first week on the farm, everything had gone wrong. And because everything had gone wrong, there were no apples or sausages for little Miss Dotty's apple and sausage cake. There was no milk to go on Mr. Greedy's daily packet of cornflakes. In fact, there were no cornflakes because Mr. Silly had fed them all to the cows. And there were no eggs for Mr. Strong's breakfast. Mr. Strong decided to investigate and walked up to the farm from town, which took rather longer than usual because he was feeling a bit weak without his usual eggy breakfast. You might say he was exhausted. And at the top of the hill, at the farm gate, he found Mr. Silly, or rather, Farmer Silly, admiring his acres and looking as pleased as Punch. Well, that explains everything, sighed Mr. Strong, who set about putting everything straight. He began by collecting some eggs for his breakfast. A lot of eggs for a big Mr. Strong breakfast. Then, once he had regained his strength, he put the pig back in its pigsty. He arranged for Mr. Fussy to replough the field in beautiful straight furrows. He fed hay to the cows. He asked little Miss Neat to replant the apple trees in the orchard in nice, neat rows, and he carried all the sheep back to their paddock. And he organised Mr. Greedy to empty the custard from the duck pond. Everything was just how it should be, until he heard a loud cry of "Out!" came from the other side of the hedge. Mr. Strong peered over the hedge, and there was Mr. Silly, playing tennis with the pig. The end. If you like this video, please subscribe down below. Welcome to Books for Kids by Flying Dragons. Today we're reading Mr. Happy and the Wizard by Roger Hargreaves. Mr. Happy goes to the town library every Saturday morning. He went there last Saturday. And he went there this Saturday. He was looking along the shelves for a book to read when a very large and rather battered red volume caught his eye. He pulled it out and looked at the spine. It read Spellbook. He was about to return it to its place when a voice suddenly said, "Don't you dare! I've been stuck on that shelf for a week." Mr. Happy dropped the book in surprise. "Ow!" said the book, for it was the book that had spoken. There was a face on the cover, nose, eyes, mouth, everything. Mr. Happy was too amazed to speak. "Oh," wheezed the book, "you get terribly cramped if you're wedged on a shelf for too long. Now then, what's your name?" "Mr. Happy," said Mr. Happy, finding his voice at last. "Hello, I am a spellbook," said the book. "I belong to a wizard, but the silly, absent-minded fool left me here. Look, he even forgot his hat. When I was asleep, someone tidied me away up on that shelf. I need a lift home. Will you help me?" Mr. Happy agreed. Wearing the wizard's hat, with the spellbook under his arm, he set off through the countryside. Mr. Happy felt just like a real wizard. Along the way, they met Mr. Forgetful, who was standing beside a phone box muttering to himself. "Do you have any spells in there that could help Mr. Forgetful's memory?" Mr. Happy asked the spell book. "Of course," said the spell book, and opened on the right page. Mr. Happy read out the spell and watched Mr. Forgetful. "I remember," cried Mr. Forgetful. "I've got to ring Mr. Chatterbox, and I forgot to lock my house. Oh no, I forgot to turn off my bath, and I didn't post that letter, and I haven't bought any milk, and I must water the plants, and..." Mr. Forgetful was frantically running around in circles by this point, worrying about all the things he had forgotten. "Oh dear, do you have any spells to make people forget things?" Mr. Happy said to the book. The spell book opened up on a different page, and as soon as Mr. Happy said the spell, Mr. Forgetful looked a lot happier. Mr. Happy and the spellbook continued on their way. They heard somebody talking to himself around a bend in the road. "If I cross over now, then I might get run over. But if I don't cross over then, how will I get to the other side? Oh dear, oh dear." It was Mr. Worry. Mr. Happy looked down at the spellbook. "Do you want to know if there are any spells to stop people worrying?" guessed the spellbook, and opened to the right page. Mr. Happy read out the spell. "I don't care," shouted Mr. Worry suddenly. "Hee hee! I'm worry-free. I'll just close my eyes and step out into the..." Crash! He walked straight into Mr. Bump on his bicycle. "Maybe worrying is safer after all," said Mr. Happy, and the spellbook flicked over a couple of pages to the spell that would return Mr. Worry to normal. It was a very long walk to the wizard's house. In the middle of the afternoon, Mr. Happy caught up with a hot and tired Mr. Small. "How about a spell for longer legs?" suggested Mr. Happy. "Coming right up," replied the spell book. Mr. Small's legs grew and grew. He strode off down the road at a terrific pace, until he reached a tree and banged his head on a branch. The same thing happened on the second tree he came to, and on the trees all the way down the road. Bang! Ouch! Bang! Ouch! Bang! Ouch! Mr. Happy winced. "Shorter legs?" asked the spellbook. Mr. Happy nodded. By the evening, they came to a wood. "We're nearly there now," said the spellbook happily. Finally, they reached a cottage in a clearing.
This is hut.
Yeah, little hut. The wizard opened the door. He was overjoyed. "My spellbook and my hat. I've been looking high and low for them for so long that I'd nearly given up hope. Thank you." He invited Mr. Happy in for supper. A wizard supper. They ate everything pie. The pie changed that they ate, so every mouthful tasted different. After supper was finished and the washing up spell had done its work, the wizard turned to Mr. Happy. "There must be something I can do for you. Choose any spell you wish. Choose anything you want." Mr. Happy smiled. After seeing what spells can do, "I think I'm happy as I am," he laughed. The end. If you like this video, please subscribe down below.
Mr. Greedy by Roger Hargreaves. A Mr. Men book, read by Books for Kids by Flying Dragons. Mr. Greedy liked to eat. In fact, Mr. Greedy loved to eat, and the more he ate, the fatter he became. And the trouble was, the fatter he became, the more hungry he became. And the more hungry he became, the more he ate. and the more he ate, the fatter he became. And so it went on. Mr. Greedy lived in a house that looked rather like himself. It was a roly-poly sort of a house. One morning, Mr. Greedy awoke rather earlier than usual. He'd been dreaming about food, as usual, and that had made him wake up feeling hungry, as usual. So Mr. Greedy got up, went downstairs and ate the most enormous breakfast. This is what Mr. Greedy had for breakfast. Toast, 2 slices, cornflakes, 1 packet, milk, 1 bottle, sugar, 1 bowlful, toast, 3 slices, eggs, 3 boiled, toast, 4 slices, butter, 1 dish, and marmalade, 1 pot. When he had finished his enormous breakfast, Mr. Greedy sat back in his chair, smiled a very satisfied smile, and thought that was a delicious breakfast. He thought to himself, now I wonder what would be nice to have for lunch. He decided in order to work up an appetite for lunch, he would go for a long walk. That morning, Mr. Greedy walked and walked and walked. Then he discovered a cave. That's funny, he thought. I don't remember seeing that there before. Mr. Greedy, being a curious sort of a fellow, decided to explore. He entered the dark cave. Inside he discovered some giant steps leading upwards. Mr. Greedy, being a curious sort of a fellow, decided to climb them. They were very steep and very difficult to climb, but with much huffing and puffing, Mr. Greedy climbed up and up. At the top of the steps, Mr. Greedy came to a door. It was, without doubt, the biggest door that Mr. Greedy had ever seen. And it wasn't quite shut. Mr. Greedy, being a curious sort of a fellow, decided to see what was on the other side of that door. So Mr. Greedy squeezed himself through the crack in the door, and there before him was an amazing sight. The biggest room in the world. The floor was as big as a field. The table in the middle of the floor was as big as a house, and the chairs around it were as high as trees. Mr. Greedy felt very small. Then he sniffed. Coming from somewhere up on top of that gigantic table was the most delicious foody smell that Mr. Greedy had ever smelled. Mr. Greedy sniffed again, and then decided that he must get up onto that table. So he began to climb up the leg of an enormous chair. It was very difficult, and it took him a long time, but eventually Mr. Greedy stood on the table. Everything was larger than life. The salt and pepper pots were both as big as pillar boxes. There was a bowl of fruit on the table, and Mr. Greedy tried to lift one of the oranges. And Mr. Greedy, being Mr. Greedy, took a bite out of one of the apples there. Then he looked around. Over on the other side of the table stood the source of that delicious smell. A huge, enormous, gigantic, colossal plate, and on the plate huge, enormous, gigantic, colossal sausages the size of pillows, and huge, enormous, gigantic, colossal potatoes the size of beach balls, and huge, enormous, gigantic, colossal peas the size of cabbages. Mr. Greedy hurried across the table towards the plate, and being Mr. Greedy, began to eat. Suddenly, a shadow fell across the plate, and Mr. Greedy found himself being picked up by a giant hand and looking into the eyes of a real live giant. "And who," thundered the giant, "are you?" Mr. Greedy was so frightened that he could only just manage to squeak his name. "Mr. Greedy," he squeaked. The giant laughed a laugh as loud as thunder. "Ha, ha, 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 ha! Greedy by name and greedy by nature," he bellowed.
Well, I think, Mr. Greedy, that you need to be taught a lesson.
What's Mommy reading me? Don't.
And what a lesson it was. The giant made Mr. Greedy eat up everything on that huge, enormous, gigantic, colossal plate. When he had finished, Mr. Greedy felt very ill indeed, as if he would burst at any minute. "Now," said the giant in a much quieter voice, "do you promise never to be greedy again?" "Oh, yes, Mr. Greedy," moaned Mr. Greedy. "I promise." "Very well," said the giant. "Then I'll let you go." Mr. Greedy climbed down from the table and went out through the door, feeling very fat and extremely miserable. And do you know that from that day to this, Mr. Greedy has kept his promise? And do you know something else as well? Mr. Greedy doesn't look like he used to anymore. He now looks like this, which I think suits him a lot better, don't you? I think it suits him a lot better, don't you?
I fell down the 2 hands.
So if you know anybody who's as greedy as Mr. Greedy used to be, you know what to tell them, don't you?
Mommy.
Beware of giants. Mr. Adventure by Roger Hargreaves, a Mr. Men book. Read by Books for Kids by Flying Dragons. Mr. Adventure liked going on holiday, but not the sort of holiday that you and I go on. He thought beaches were boring. He wanted the thrill and excitement of an adventure holiday. He liked to go to places that would make your hair stand on end. Mr. Adventure went on holiday exploring remote frozen lands. Epic expeditions across the white wilderness. He went on holiday diving in the deepest oceans, discovering sunken wrecks. He went on holiday trekking through far-flung tropical jungles, sleeping under the stars with one eye open on the jungle creatures. However, this year Mr. Adventure had a problem. He did not have enough money to go on one of his wild adventures. To go on a new adventure, he would need to get a new job. And that's just what he did. He got a job as a postman, but being Mr. Adventure, he found posting letters into letterboxes rather boring. So to make it more interesting, he took his mountaineering gear to work with him and climbed the wall of each house and posted the letters down the chimney. This certainly made delivering letters more interesting. However, it was also meant everybody's letters were late and covered in soot. So he was told not to come back to work at the post office. The next job he got was as a plumber. And of course, Mr. Adventure found fitting pipes and repairing taps boring. To make it more exciting, Mr. Adventure took his canoe to work when he went to fix a leak. This definitely made plumbing more exciting, but it also made people's houses wetter. Much, much wetter. And so he was sacked from his plumbing job. And it turned out that wearing skis to his building job was also not a very good idea. Things were not going well. Mr. Adventure had not saved a penny. He looked longingly at the map on his wall. How he wished he could go on a proper adventure. Then Mr. Adventure got a new job. A job as a firefighter. A firefighter called to emergencies. Emergencies like climbing a very tall tree to save a cat. This was not boring. The next day he had to break down a door with the axe. This was definitely not boring. And the next day he had to put out a fire in a burning house. Mr. Adventure had found a job that he liked. A job that suited him down to the ground and right up to the top of the ladder. In no time at all, Mr. Adventure had saved enough money to go on holiday. Enough money to go to the wildest, remotest, most dangerous place you could think of in the whole wide world. So where did Mr. Adventure go? Why, he stayed at home.
being a fireman was a much greater adventure. If you enjoyed this book, please do hit subscribe and let us know if you would like any more books. We've got plenty more Mr. Men to choose from already, and we'd love to always do more.